Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our WatchGuard webinar, Credential Theft, the Dark Side of the Dark Web. My name is Christine Ramsdell, Marketing Specialist here at WatchGuard. I'm also joined by two presenters, Marc Laliberte, Senior Security Analyst, and Alex Cagnoni, Director of Authentication for Product Management. But before we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. So the first is that the audio stream through your computer only, so there is no dial-in. Second, all the widgets on your menu are resizable and movable. Third, there is a Q&A box located on the left side of your screen, and all questions will be answered at the end. And this on-demand recording of this will be available as your same live link. And last but not least, we do offer CPE credit for all our webinars. In this case, this webinar is for 30 minutes, which is equal to half a credit. Please check in with your certification body for more details. So without further ado, I'm going to start things off and pass it off to Marc to introduce himself. Marc?
Thank you so much. Like I said, I'm Marc Laliberte, Senior Security Analyst at WatchGuard Technologies, and joining me today is Alex Cagnoni. And we are going to talk to you about the dark web, how it works, and how your stuff ends up on it. And then, of course, after scaring you for a bit, we'll go over how to keep yourself safe from these style of cyber attacks. So because we're a bit short on time, I want to make sure that we go ahead and just hop right in. I'll start with a quick agenda of what we're going to discuss today. First, we'll go over a pretty high-level overview of what the dark web is, how it works, and how it differentiates from the traditional internet that we all use every day. Then we'll go over how cyber criminals get your data, how your data ends up on the dark web, the different attack methods they might use. And then finally, we'll end with some defensive tips on keeping yourself safe from cyber attacks. So without further ado, let's hop into what you guys are all here for. What exactly is the dark web? And before we can explain what the dark web is, we first have to start at the very top. What is the surface web? The surface web, by definition, is anything on the internet that can be indexed by a search engine. So every single day, Google, Yahoo, Bing have these crawlers that go across every single page that they can find on the internet and index them. They identify what the content is, what the subject might be, so that when you go and search for how do I cook a souffle on Google, the correct articles pop up in their list. Anything that can be touched by these crawlers is technically a part of the surface web. Now, that doesn't include everything on the internet that is accessible from a web browser, though. Right below the surface web is something called the deep web, which is basically anything that search engine crawlers can't get to. And that's pages that might be hidden behind search filters, could be pages that aren't linked to from anywhere else on the internet, and pages hidden behind authentication. So for example, if you have a private social media account, that's technically a part of the deep web as opposed to the surface web. Whereas if your social media account is entirely public, that would be a part of the surface web, assuming that access to the account was allowed without any authentication. Right below the deep web, though, is where it starts to get really interesting. This is what's called the dark web, and it's a portion of the internet that is intentionally hidden and inaccessible through normal web browsers. You're not going to be able to hop onto the dark web using Google Chrome or Firefox. You need specialized software in order to access these sites. The two most common ones these days are Tor, or the Onion Router, and I2P, the Invisible Internet Project. The most popular one by far out of those two, though, is Tor, and that's what we're going to focus most of our discussion on today. So how exactly does Tor work? How does the dark web work? Well, it all starts with cryptography, and we should first start with a bit of an overview of something called asymmetric cryptography. So traditional cryptography, when you encrypt a file or you encrypt a bit of text, you use one key to lock it using a math function, and then that same key to then unlock it. With asymmetric cryptography, though, those keys are broken up into a public key, which is given out freely, usually posted anywhere publicly, hence the name, and a private key that is kept secretly on the server. And any data that's encrypted with the private key can only be decrypted with the public key, and vice versa. If you encrypt a message using a server's public key, only that private key can then decrypt the data. And this is how even on the surface web, most encrypted web communications work. When you go to a website and you see that little padlock in the search bar, you know you've visited using HTTPS. It's using asymmetric cryptography in order to protect your connection to that website. And that even adds some privacy on its own too. When I go to a google.com and start searching around, my internet service provider can't see exactly what I'm doing while I'm on Google. They just know that I went to google.com. This is, and the fact that they know that I'm going to google.com, though, is still a bit of a security or privacy concern, especially if I'm a threat actor or maybe just someone who's trying to protect my identity, say if I'm a journalist embedded in a hostile nation, for example. So with the traditional surface web, when you make a request out to a website, it in general sets up a encrypted tunnel, basically. Encrypts the connection, and anyone in the middle of that connection can only see that you have gone to website whatever. But if I'm a cyber criminal and I'm trying to buy a bunch of guns, for example, or drugs or whatever else you might be able to find on the dark web, just the fact that they can tell I'm going to these shady or malicious websites is often enough to get me in trouble. So what Tor does is it actually protects not just the content that you are passing between you and the website, but also the identities and the locations of both you and the website you are visiting. And it does that in a pretty cool way. So let's say I've got a setup here where I want to connect to a remote server over Tor. I want to look up, maybe it's a press-related website where I can post my article about some oppressive government that I'm currently embedded in. Well, with Tor, the entire network is built up over this collection of nodes. Anyone can participate as a node on the Onion Router network. A lot of organizations set up what are called exit nodes, or nodes that allow connections back to the surface web as ways to protect identities of individuals on the Tor network. But when I decide I want to go visit a specific website, Tor does a few things on the back end. First off, it's going to pick a number of nodes, usually more than 4, less than 7, and it's going to build a circuit through them. Where first, it's going to set up an encrypted connection between me and that first node so that only that node and I know that we are talking to each other. Then inside that connection, it sets up a new connection between that first node and the second node. So that second node now only knows that it's talking to the first node. It doesn't know who I am because that is protected by encryption. Same goes on down the hops, down the lane, so that by the end of this whole setup, the client, or the first hop only knows the client that it's connecting to and the second hop. And then that final one only knows the server it's connecting to and the hop before it. No one knows the identity of both members of these connections. And this is where the Onion Router gets its name from. Each hop along this network has a layer of encryption. And as a connection traverses through this tunnel, a layer is pulled off so it can figure out where it needs to route to next. And then another layer is pulled off so it can figure out where it routes to next, just like you would see with an onion. So where did Tor come from? You might think that it was originally designed for malicious actions. Maybe it was created by cyber criminals in order to try and mask their nefarious activities. But that's actually not the case. In fact, the Onion Router was actually developed in part by the US Naval Research Laboratory and several other computer scientists, and then further developed by DARPA. It was actually first designed to protect US intelligence communications from operatives in other countries, where not only do they need to protect the content of the message that they're sending back to our country, but they need to protect the identity of the person that is sending that message. By going through the onion routing and peeling off those layers of encryption, anyone sitting in the middle of this connection, maybe jacked into a fiber optic cable on the ocean floor, won't be able to tell who is talking to who. They'll just see this encrypted onion, basically. These days, though, it's maintained by the Tor project, which was initially sponsored by the EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which does a lot of work for data privacy on the internet. But these days, the majority of its funding still comes from the US government because it has far more uses than just cybercrime. So what are some of the sites that you might find on the dark web? For example, Facebook has an onion website, a dark web website, so you can't even escape them on the dark web. There's a couple of hidden wikis, which are basically a phone directory of a lot of public dark web websites, usually marketplaces or other places like Facebook, for example, that you might want to find and don't necessarily need to remain hidden. And then also marketplaces for quite literally anything. You can buy just about anything you want on the dark web. When it comes to data, though, There's a whole lot of different types of data that you can find on the dark web. Generally it boils down to PII, although intellectual property ends up on there as well. And these days, it seems like almost every single day, or at least every single week, there's another massive password dump for sale on the dark web that some cyber criminal has managed to steal from some unsuspecting company. In fact, it was just last week or so that a hacker organization known as the Shiny Hunters released or put up a bundle for, I think, $18,000 for 70 million records for sale on the dark web. But funny enough, different information has different prices, different values, and they might be more or less than you would suspect. For example, your social security number in general is only worth about $1, usually quite a bit less. And that's because at this point, most individuals' social security numbers are basically freely available if you know where to look for them because of all these data breaches that have occurred. Credit card or debit card information that still works is worth a decent amount of money because attackers are pretty good at cashing out as much as they can before they get picked up by fraud detectors. Really interestingly, though, medical records and school records tend to be worth the most on the dark web because they contain a lot of information that can be used to steal your identity, or in the case of medical records, conduct insurance fraud or billing fraud, where an attacker has all your information. They can set up a fake doctor's office, for example, and bill your insurance company for visits that never happened. And that tends to fly under the radar pretty well. So how does this data, or how prolific are these data breaches on the dark web and just across our industry as a whole? Well, first off, when it comes to breaches, the cost is going up per record. On average, last year, breaches cost organizations $150 per record lost. And I want to point this out because a lot of small organizations might think, oh, I'm a small shop. Why would anyone want to target me? But the fact is, every company has something of value. Otherwise, they simply wouldn't be in business. And this cost could be the records themselves, or it could be the cost to bring in a company and clean up after a breach, the reputation hits, maybe the fines that you have to pay for being found out of compliance. So even a small organization with only a couple hundred customers or a couple thousand records could still add up to hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in damages for that company because of a data breach. And when it comes to detecting that we've been the victim of a data breach, companies just simply aren't doing a good enough job right now. This data comes from the Poneman Institute, which puts out a research study every year highlighting details about data breaches. And one of the numbers that they've been tracking for the last few years is this mean time to identify number, or the time it takes to detect when you have been the victim of a breach from the point where that breach actually occurred. And in 2019, that number was 206 days. It's like 7, 8 months from the point of infection to the point where you realize that you've been the victim of a breach. And even then, once you've identified that you've been the victim of a breach, it took companies on average 73 days to clean up after the fact. So we're talking 9, 10 months from the point of infection to the point where you get the cyber criminal off of your network. And during that time, they're not going to do all of their bad stuff right away. They're first going to do some reconnaissance and try and phish some of your employees to gain other privileged credentials. Then they're going to use those credentials to pivot and phish your customers and your partners and the vendors you work with. They're going to figure out where all your data backups are, where all your security services are, and disable them so that maybe they can install ransomware or remote access Trojan and exfiltrate all of this data off of your network. And really, this is because a lot of organizations focus all of their budget and spending and attention on preventing cyber attack, and not enough on identifying and responding to cyber attacks that have occurred. And when it comes to how these criminals are getting in, it almost always starts with a username and a password. This comes from the latest Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, where they found that 70% of breaches in 2019 leveraged stolen credentials. That's because we designed all of our systems to keep the bad guys out and let the good guys in, and how we differentiate them is with a username and a password. And so if a cyber criminal can, say, trick one of your employees into giving up a username or password willingly, they can often have the keys to the kingdom just to walk right in through the front door, bypassing a lot of your security protections. So how do these breaches actually occur? I've hinted at one of the first big ones here, and that's spear phishing. And phishing's actually been around for quite some time, Back in the 90s and early 2000s, you would get those emails saying, oh, I'm a Nigerian prince and I'll give you $50 million if you just give me 10,000 to get out of jail or whatever. The good news is we're starting to get better as individuals and users is recognizing that that's bogus. And no, there's not a Nigerian prince that wants to give me $10 million to help them get out of their country. The bad news is, though, that these cyber criminals are getting a lot better at crafting really believing spear phishing emails now, where they'll use automated social networking recon. They'll figure out who you work with, who you work for, who your friends are. They'll find resources that look like your brand or brands you may work with, like UPS delivery notifications or Amazon delivery notification. And then they'll use this information to create a carefully crafted email targeted towards specific individuals or teams within an organization. And these days, 90 to 95% of breaches start with a spear phish. That could either be to trick someone into running a remote access Trojan on their computer, or convincing someone to go to a website and willingly giving up their username and password because they think they're logging into something. And when it comes to how they trick users into giving up their passwords, they're getting a lot better at it. This screenshot actually comes from a phish that we caught using our DNS watch server a few months back, where the attacker had set up a fake file share link within an email and tried to convince the user to click on that link and then go log in to view this file share. That link actually contains the email address of the recipient so that when they load up this page, it looks like they might have an active session that they just need to log back into. It looks like it might be a valid Microsoft login page, but most frightening, the domain name for this, where this phish is being hosted, is actually a valid Microsoft-owned domain. Because of cloud hosting services like AWS and Azure, cyber criminals can register their own subdomains to valid Microsoft or Amazon or Apple-owned domains, like in this case, Service Manager 00, and then host whatever they want. So in this case, a website that's designed to look like a login form to steal credentials from users. These days, it's not enough to just hover over a link and say, oh, it's Microsoft.com or Windows.com. That's not sufficient anymore. Now you have to treat everything with skepticism, even if it looks like it's a legitimate company link. Next up is also account takeover. This is one of the main ways that attackers get into an organization after they've obtained those credentials from a phish. And we've seen time and time again this cyclical thing of a company or some executive saying, oh, passwords are dead. And then, oh, Sony loses 77 million passwords. Then a Google exec says, oh, passwords are really dead. Then Yahoo suffers a breach of 1 billion passwords. Then, for example, my team in the WatchGuard Threat Lab just last year got a hold of a database where there's actually a typo on this slide. It wasn't 2.2 billion passwords. We got a hold of 22 billion passwords in plain text for free on the surface web. And you can imagine what a motivated attacker with a bit of money might be able to purchase on the dark web. And they're using these credentials to go after organizations with tools like password spraying, where they will find a legitimate account. Maybe they know that I have a Netflix account, for example, and then they will just try the top 50 or 100 most common passwords against that. And because users tend to pick not strong or unique passwords or for each of their individual accounts, this tends to work more often than not. Alternatively, they can use techniques like credential stuffing, where let's say I don't pick a unique password for each of my accounts and one of them gets breached. The attacker will take those credentials and then try them on other services. And if I didn't pick a unique password for each of those services, they can often just log straight in. Additionally, they might use tools like Mimikatz or Windows Credential Editor, where if they can gain access to a computer, they can just steal your password straight out of memory from that computer. We've also seen some forms of multi-factor authentication simply not being secure enough as well. Specifically, SMS-based multi-factor is no longer considered secure and is actually being deprecated by NIST because it turns out it's pretty easy to social engineer that 18-year-old on the other end of T-Mobile's help desk and convince them to port over your victim's phone number to a SIM card or a phone under your control, which then lets you gain access to that SMS message and that one-time key to log into their account. So now that we've kind of scared you for a bit, let's pivot and talk about how you can actually defend yourself against cyber attacks and defend yourself from your data ending up on the dark web. And first off, it starts with a defense in depth, a layered defense, because there is no such thing as a silver bullet when it comes to security. You want to make sure you have multiple layers of security protections so that if one of them fails, there's something else behind it to catch whatever that threat is before it's able to reach its target. For example, maybe you use intrusion prevention to detect known exploits of vulnerabilities in services. But if an attacker is able to find a zero-day vulnerability and start attacking something, you need layers of anti-malware to detect whatever threats they try and install on that system. Even things like botnet feeds, where you can identify where connections are going to and block that command and control connection from reaching its endpoint, can save you from a breach. Because even if your system is technically infected by malware, if it can't connect back to a command and control server, it means that it can't actually do anything malicious or steal data from your network. And when it comes to phishing and account takeover specifically, first and foremost is multi-factor authentication. It doesn't matter if they get a hold of my username and password if I have some secure second factor backing up that authentication. It would mean they'd have to break into my house and steal my phone and probably cut off my thumb to get past the biometric locking on it before they're able to get in my account. Additionally, phishing awareness training is critical for your users. You need to teach them how to spot phishes, how to spot suspicious emails, and just treat everything with skepticism so that they don't fall victim to these attacks. DNS firelong is another great tool to go along with phishing awareness training, where you can actually defang or neuter malicious links, and instead of going to the phishing target, they get redirected to a safe black hole, which in the case with our DNS Watch service, can also provide some phishing training in the moment, which is critical. And then also advanced malware protection, because cyber criminals are getting better and better at hiding their tools like Mimikatz and Windows Credential Editor from signature-based anti-malware defenses. And how about I hand it off to Alex now to round out some more defenses you can do to keep yourself safe.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. Great stuff, scary stuff. One thing I wanted to ask everyone, or ask yourselves, are you still using stolen credentials? How do you know that? Maybe your credential is already in the dark web. You don't know about that. But let's think about the passwords that you are using every day today. Are those passwords old passwords, like from 5 years ago, 3 years ago? Are you changing the passwords from time to time? It's really hard for users to do that. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, there was something that went through the internet, which was 500,000 users or Zoom passwords, Zoom credentials that were in the dark web for less than a cent each. So people were asking me what happened in this case. Was Zoom breached? Zoom was not breached. They used this technique called credential stuffing that Mark mentioned in here. Basically, they used leaked passwords. They used passwords from the dark web, and they tried in different accounts, in I don't know how many million accounts there are in Zoom, but about 500,000 or 520,000, if I'm not mistaken, were using the same passwords that they were using before, and that was part of breaches. And this happens a lot. That's because most of the people will try to use the same passwords over and over again with just small variations, but they're going to have 2 to 5 different passwords and just start using it because it's almost impossible for a human mind to just memorize all different passwords. It's really a hard work, and this is what happened in this case with Zoom. Now, multi-factor authentication can protect yourself and block the attacks. And this is just an example. Let's say a hacker is trying to get into your network. This is me working from home with the nice glasses, and the dark web stolen credential this hacker got from the dark web. Username Alex Cagnoni, password Stinky 2012. Maybe my dog was called Stinky. So they found this username and password, and they're gonna this hacker will try to use those credentials to access the VPN and access my network. So they try to do that, and what happens? Well, I'm using exactly the same password. But for my luck, I'm protected with multi-factor authentication. And I have my mobile phone with me at home, and then all out of the blue, I received this push request on my phone asking if I'm trying to connect to the network using the VPN. And this is coming from a completely different place. So what do? I would just deny the attack. So I received a push message. This is the multi-factor authentication working for me. I deny the access and the connection is blocked. And a very important thing is that the attacker in this case will receive an authentication failed error, and they might even think that the credentials that this hacker has is not valid anymore. They might even throw away. But for me, I know that my password was compromised because I received this push request, so now it's time to change the password. Okay, so this is how the multi-factor authentication can work for you. There are some ways you can test it and experience it. If you go to our website, there are walkthroughs. You can go to our management portal demo and authentication demo to see how it works, what's the user experience, and you can also try it and see how multi-factor authentication can be used to protect your credentials, even if they were stolen and leaked and they're in the dark web. Okay. Thanks for watching that, and I guess we're going through questions now.
All right, so we are doing questions right now. So the first question I have, Mark, is for you. Does Norton Safe Search really help us stay away from fake sites?
In general, yes. So they're a type of web categorization or web filtering service that can keep you away from some malicious websites or less reputable websites. Again, nothing's perfect though, so you don't want to rely just on one single service like that. You want to make sure that you have a layered defense to back it up in case they happen to not know about a brand new phishing site or something along those lines.
Got it. Thank you, Mark. And just to clarify to folks that this presentation will be available on demand, same link. And also we have the presentation, a copy for you in the handout section in the same Q&A window here. So I have another question here. This sounds like more for Alex. What password managers are recommended as the best? Or Mark?
That's a very good question. There are a lot of password managers in the market. I always recommend you to choose the one that you feel more comfortable with. You can see some feedback from people that are using. I don't have a preferred one. There are some big ones. And you're going to see that also some of those big guys with password managers, they had some issues as well. You can see that some of those password managers at some point in time, some of those had some breaches as well. So you have to be careful, but definitely a password manager is a good thing to have. And also be careful because it's not also a guarantee that your password will not be leaked. Like Mark mentioned Mimikatz. Mimikatz can dump your password from your Windows machine. It doesn't matter how secure it is. So it's always good to have a password manager associated with multi-factor authentication.
Yep, and if I were to throw out a couple names, LastPass, OnePass, and KeyPass are probably the three biggest and most reputable ones. I know Mozilla Firefox just launched their own password manager too, which I have not personally had a chance to look at, but I've heard good things about that one as well.
Great. Thank you both. All right, so we're getting questions here. So let's see here. Here's one from Mark. Do you recommend using Tor daily as it has that much layers of security?
So the downside to using Tor is that because of the way that your packets are routed across the Tor network, it does add a quite considerable amount of latency, and it completely throttles your throughput. So I would say if you are like massively privacy conscious, it's a useful tool, but it's not really for daily use unless you don't mind being back in like the early 2000s in terms of internet speed.
Thank you. And I have another question. This actually could be for both. So where is a good place to see the latest password breaches?
Sure. So one of my favorites, and probably like the industry standard, I guess, is Have I Been Pwned? It's a website put up by Troy Hunt, who's a very well-known breach expert, I guess you would call him. And because his website and him have been around for so long, he's got a lot of contacts on like the dark web and the underground where he can get a lot of these breaches for free, basically, instead of having to pay for them. So they tend to have a pretty well updated and curated list of breaches, and they allow you to see for any given email account whether or not you've been the victim of a breach. You can also anonymously look up whether your password has been part of a breach too. Pretty useful tool.
Okay, thank you. And I have the last question here. Looks like we're out of time. I know we have questions still rolling in, but we'll get to those via email. So thank you everyone for all those great questions. We'll answer them privately. So the last question I have here is for Mark or Alex. This actually could be both. What do you do if credentials are already compromised and the hacker is asking for ransomware? What do you do at that point?
If your credentials are already compromised and the hacker is asking for ransom, the easy solution is to reset your password or your credentials. Again, like you want to make sure that you set yourself up where you're never going to be put in a position where you feel like you do have to pay a cyber criminal money in order to get back to normal in terms of business. So make sure that you've got a layered defense, like we mentioned a few times. Make sure you've got good backups and you've tested your backups in terms of data restoration. And then make sure you're using multi-factor authentication so that it doesn't matter if I don't want to say it doesn't matter. It is less important if a cyber criminal manages to get a hold of your password because you've got another layer now backing up your authentication.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing is that a lot of times what they do, they search in the dark web for old passwords, and they're going to send emails like phishing emails or emails asking for ransomware to you, and they're going to show a password that you used in the past just to say, okay, we hacked your password, this is to prove, and I saw you doing something wrong, so I want your money for that. So a lot of times that's all they do. They just get a node password to try and get you some money. So just think about it and to make sure that you're not just giving away money because of a previously leaked password.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex and Mark, for all that great information, and thank you to all the attendees who made it here with us today. I just want to remind you for the recording, you can use the same link to watch the recording of this. You can also download the slides under the handouts tab of the window, so you'll have that available. We'll also send out an email of the recording and also post it on our site. Thank you everyone so much for all your time today, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks everyone.